The following video features a model kit that is pre-production and may not be indicative of final retail versions of the product. It was also received free of charge for the purpose of review, and all opinions expressed remain my own. Thanks to Beacon Models for sending this out to me. This is a Bf109. But it's not just any Bf109, it's a Beacon Models Bf109. This is the first of a new range of model kits from this new company, and the version I have here is effectively a test build to see if they're going to be any good. And spoilers? Yes. Yes it is. But without any further ado, let's get into this video where I build and review this Messerschmitt Bf109E-4 in 1:144 scale from Beacon Models. Hello everyone, I'm Matt, this is Model Minutes, and welcome back to the workbench. If you previously saw my unboxing video on this kit, you'll know that this features a wealth of details, but did feature a small misalignment of the mould, which should be fixed for the actual production run of the kits. As this is a build video, if you want to see more information about the unboxing, you can check out that video and I'll link it in the description. This time though, I'll be assembling the kit and seeing what kind of indication it will give of this upcoming range. I'll pop a list of products I used during the build on the screen now to give you an idea of paints and things that you might want to get if you eventually get your hands on one of these kits. But on with the build. First up, I'm going to use my cutters to snip all the parts away from the sprue, and then any excess plastic or rough areas can be sanded smooth with a nail file. There was a little bit of flash in a few places which I carefully removed with a sharp knife. I'll check the fit of the parts as I go through, and I can see here that the fuselage halves aren't quite flush. I simply opened up the alignment holes with a small drill bit. I think this is a side effect of the tooling misalignment, resulting in a tiny bit of extra plastic in those places. I'm using Tamiya extra thin cement during this build, so let's start gluing things together. The control panel is glued into the floor of the cockpit. There is a good level of detail here for such a small model. I then added it into place on the cockpit wall, but now that I add the other half of the fuselage there is a gap. It's as if the control panel is a bit big. I removed the control panel and sanded it down. Its edges just needed rounding off to make them fit a little better. I messaged the guys at Beacon and they actually investigated to see if there was an error. Turns out the side of the control panel hadn't been contoured in their CAD software. The red area is where it conflicts with the fuselage. They tell me they fixed the design of this part and forward it onto their toolmakers for the final versions, which is great to hear. And with that part sanded down, the gap is now closed. It was an easy fix really. I picked up some new paints for this kit, a Vallejo airbrush ready set of Luftwaffe colours. I have to thank my patrons and channel members because it was with their support that I can afford to get these new products to try out. Thanks to these guys on screen, and a shout out to my newest member Eldritch Emerald on Patreon. Welcome to the club. For more information, check the links in the description. So, first up I'm going to use this Vallejo RLM02 Grey. I thinned it with a little Tamiya X20A thinner. Although these are airbrush ready paints, I'm actually going to hand paint this kit, mostly because it's so small that I'm not sure I have the patience for all that fiddly masking, and also I want to see if the panel lines and details can survive the rigours of being hand painted. I guess time will tell. The entire cockpit area was painted with this colour. I'm not going to bother with picking out the details because when the canopy is on, I'm not going to be able to see them. But if you wanted to, there are more than enough details there to do so. When that paint was dry, I could glue the two fuselage halves together. I cleaned up the wing part, taking a bit of time around the cannons to make them a little tidier and finer. I'm going to install the 4 small bombs under the plane, so I need to open up the right holes for the bomb mount. It's the 2 holes labelled with a C, so I carefully open them up with a small drill bit. With that done, the mount can be cemented into place. The wings can now be glued onto the fuselage. The air intakes can be added to their slots on the lower sides of the wings. The tail surfaces are cemented into their slots on the rudder. Then the support struts can be added. This was fiddly, and as I was using an exploded diagram, as proper instructions don't exist yet, I had to use a bit of trial and error to figure out which way around they went. The engine cowling was next to be added, and this was followed by the landing gear. The aerial mast is glued into the hole behind the cockpit. The propeller is glued to the backplate, and then the spinner is added over the top. I'll add the propeller to the model after I've painted it. Speaking of painting, this RLM65 light blue was thinned just like before and then carefully applied to the lower surfaces. At least 2 layers of this paint was brushed on, leaving each coat to dry before adding the next. I then used some tape to mask the edges of the paint on the fuselage. A little bit more of the light blue was then painted along the edges to hopefully build up a barrier and prevent the other colours from bleeding through. The RLM02 grey makes a reappearance and was again thinned just like before. It was painted onto all the upper surfaces, and again a couple of layers would be needed. I've been sent a 3D printed canopy in clear resin, as the tooling for the plastic ones hadn't been made when I received this sample. It was carefully cut from its supports and cleaned up. Vallejo gloss varnish was painted onto the canopy to make it a bit clearer and give a smoother glass-like finish. 3D printing leaves layer lines, and I was trying to make them a bit less noticeable. Vallejo RLM71 dark green is then carefully painted onto the canopy frames. I'll go back and tidy them up off camera later. It's really hard doing this to tiny parts with a camera in the way. Whilst I've got this paint out, I also applied it in the camouflage pattern that Battle of Britain era Bf109s featured. Again, I did this by hand, following some reference pictures for the correct positions. When the paint was dry, the tape was removed. There is a little bit of bleed in places, which I'll tidy up with some more blue paint off screen. The gloss varnish is back and will be thinned with a little water before being applied to the entire plane. It should give a smooth layer for the decals to stick onto and hopefully prevent them from silvering. Again, the decals are pre-production samples, and I decided to do the one for the complete scheme rather than using the sheet of generic ones to try and make up my own one. I'll use Micro Set in the blue bottle as my first stage setting solution, then Micro Sol in the red as the second stage. The decals were soaked in warm water and left to release from their backing paper. They did need a little extra time to soften than I'm used to though, before they were ready to go. Micro Set was brushed into the areas the transfers were going to be applied, then the decals were slid off their backing paper and into place. I found that they were thinner decals than I'm used to and really flexible. They wanted to fold over on themselves all the time, so I had to be really careful when sticking them onto the model. After some considerable time and patience, I got to the point where they were all on the model, without tearing or folding a single one. So as they've cured a little bit, it's time to add the Micro Sol from the red bottle, simply brushing thin layers on top as needed. This will make them settle down into the details and look as though they are painted on rather than transfers. Whilst those water stickers are curing, Vallejo black paint was used on the propeller and wheels. A little more gloss varnish was thinned with water and then applied on top of the now dry decals. This will protect them in the next step, which is a little weathering. A brown and black oil paint was mixed with white spirit to make a thin wash. This was then added to the model and allowed to seep into the recessed details and panel lines. I would add a little extra in the areas around the exhaust to give an impression of stains from the guns and engine, whilst any excess could be carefully removed using a cotton bud with a little more white spirit on it. Vallejo matte varnish was then thinned with a little water and brushed onto the entire model after all that oil wash had dried. A number of thin coats was needed, and it would dull down the gloss that was applied earlier, whilst also protecting all that work we've previously done. Vallejo olive brown was brushed onto the 4 bombs and left to dry. A little Humbrol precision poly cement was then used to glue the wheels onto the landing gear legs, as well as the propeller on the nose and bombs on the belly. A small amount of superglue was carefully applied to the cockpit area, and then the 3D printed canopy was popped in place. I've got some of this elastic rigging which will be perfect for the aerial wire in this tiny scale. Some superglue is put on the area the wire needs to be attached. The wire then takes a few seconds to bond. Repeating the process and stretching the rigging allows it to keep some tension whilst it is glued on top of the mast. The excess can then be cut away. And that's it! The build of my pre-production Bf109E-4 in 1:144 scale from Beacon models is now complete. Well, almost. It seems a shame to leave such a good looking model on the shelf on its own like this. How about we add a few things? To start with, what about a little base? I designed and then printed this 70mm diameter base using my Elegoo Mars 2 Pro printer. I think it will make a good airfield diorama along with this 3D printed pilot, which is a free download from the Beacon Models website. Beacon are big fans of 3D printing accessories for their kits. As a side note, I also designed my base to have a tarmac style top, but I won't use this one for this project. Maybe next time. I sanded the edges of the base to make them a little neater. Humbrol 110 natural wood colour was then brushed onto the top to give an impression of earth. PVA glue can then be added as well, spread out into a thin layer ready for some static grass. I shook this over the base until there was a good layer of fibres. The excess was tapped off and would be collected for future use. I used the same black paint from before to paint the edge of the base to make it look a little more attractive. Now let's work on the pilot. Tamiya XF15 flat flesh was used on his, well, fleshy bits, his hands and his face. XF24 dark grey was used as his overall uniform colour, whilst the Humbrol 110 natural wood is used on his hair. Vallejo medium yellow was carefully applied to his life vest. Humbrol 62 matte leather can then be brushed onto his parachute and all of those straps. I painted his boots in the Vallejo black. Vallejo umber wash was then used on the whole figure to add shade and contrast. Finally, a small amount of superglue was added to his feet and he was stuck on the base. I feel like the base needs a few more details though, so I found some oil drums, crates, jerry cans and a bag on Thingiverse, which were suitably painted and also glued into place. Oh yeah, and let's not forget the discarded helmet. This is another Beacon Models extra, a tiny Kugelwagen. It's still a work in progress, but they are letting me use it on this diorama, and we may see it on their website in the future. I thinned down the black paint with some thinner, and then used it on all the window areas and wheels. The Tamiya dark grey makes a reappearance and is used as the base colour for all the metalwork on the vehicle. Vallejo khaki was used as the colour of the fabric roof, being careful to not get it on the areas already painted. This black wash was used all over the lower areas of the model, whilst the sepia shade was used on the khaki fabric, with a little on the wheels as well. Humbrol Grey Primer No. 1 was then dry brushed onto the model to bring out the raised details and add further contrast. Vallejo Aluminium was used to carefully paint the lenses on the lights at the front of the model. The Humbrol Natural Wood colour paint was dry brushed to add some subtle hints of mud and dirt on the lower areas of the model, being used around the wheels in particular. The gloss varnish was then applied to the front windscreen of the vehicle to make it look as though there was glass installed there. And yeah, not bad for a quick addition to the diorama and being a work in progress design. Some superglue was popped onto its wheels and then it was also added to the display base. And now, with that, I think I'm ready to finally call this little project done. So let's talk about the Bf109 kit. Bearing in mind that it is pre-production and it had that issue with the tool misalignment, I didn't find any of the issues that it caused to be particularly problematic, and they were easy to overcome. Some holes needed opening up with a drill bit, little bits of flash needed cutting away, and other parts needed sanding down to make them fit. Beacon Models assures me that the toolmakers are fixing this alignment issue, so the production kits shouldn't have these small problems. But that being said, I've known actual kits to have worse issues. The fact that they listened to my query, investigated, and sent off edits to their toolmakers of the cockpit parts regarding the fit issue tells me that these guys really care about delivering a quality product in the end as well. I found the kit to be a genuinely enjoyable build, and everything just seemed to work out. The decals were a little fiddly, but I'm told they're looking at getting cartograph ones for the future release versions. But even then, the decals they sent me here were more than acceptable in print quality. The 3D printed canopy I think is a good stand-in for the injection moulded versions they are currently getting sorted out. I did try and sort out those layer lines, but in such a small scale and at high magnifications they are still noticeable. Cameras can be quite harsh at times, especially as from normal distances you can't even see them. Some people have expressed their concerns about the panel lines on the plane being a bit deep, but if like me you're going to brush paint it, I think they're spot on. They are just deep enough to keep a wash in the recesses, but not so shallow that the details are lost after 3 or 4 coats of paint. Bearing in mind as well that the pre-order price for these kits is £15 and you get 2 of these little kits in the box, I think that it's a really good price for the level of detail and quality that I've seen so far. And I think it's worth mentioning that the parts included give the option of building not only an E4 version, but also the early and late variants with different armament options and even a tropical filter. So plenty of scope there. But now let's talk about the extras I included in this build. The crates and things which I added to give this a bit of a resupply area vibe were all from Thingiverse, and I'll add the links in the description to those creators. Bearing in mind that none of them were designed to be printed this small, I'm impressed with how well my Elgu printer actually managed it. The pilot figure, as mentioned, is available as a free download from the Beacon Models website. If you sign up to the newsletter, you'll get a number of STL files of this figure in a few of the popular scales. The details on this are great too, and they made it quite easy to paint despite being so small. The Kubelwagen too is a great looking model despite being a work in progress and not yet available to download. I'm told that they may add it as an extra download or as a Kickstarter stretch goal in the future, depending on the interest the range gets. Oh yeah, and the display base is a design from yours truly. I'm a bit rusty at 3D design, but would like to do more in the future. And if you would like to get your hands on both versions of my 70mm display base, I'll put them on my Patreon as a free download. Yes, that's right, a free download. Just have a look at the link in the description. But anyways, I think this is a good example of what could be done with 3D printing, and the fact that Beacon Models are looking to embrace this new model making asset to not only complement but enhance their injection moulded product range is definitely the right way to go in the future. Maybe next time, instead of standing pilots, we'll get some seated ones to fill in those empty cockpits. Fingers crossed. So yeah, in conclusion, the pre-production Bf109E kit that I received from Beacon Models is absolutely fantastic. Having a high level of detail for the scale and good quality parts, it certainly puts other kits in larger scales to shame. Yes, it did have a few little issues, but fingers crossed they get ironed out for the full scale production run. And with that, I think it's time to end this video. Let me know in the comments what you think of this kit, and do you think you might get one for yourself? Also, I'd be interested to hear any suggestions for 3D printed accessories I could have a go at designing in a future video. Clicking some of the buttons under the video would be greatly appreciated too, especially the thumbs up if you enjoyed this one, and if you're new here, the red one with the bell next to it in particular. Once again, a big thanks to Beacon Models for sending this out to me for review, and to my patrons and channel members for their extra support in my modelling addiction. Finally, a massive thank you to you for watching this one, and I'll see you on the workbench again next time. A tiny Kubelwagen. Kubelwagen. Is it a Kubelwagen? Kubelwagen. Let's just quickly Google that. Kubelwagen. Kubelwagen. That's what he said.